All right. Now, I promised today I wasn't going to mention MabThera or rituximab because that's really yesterday's news. That's the first time I've been able to say that. The reason why I say it is there are now 2 new treatments that bind to the very same target that MabThera has. I mean, MabThera revolutionised the treatment of B-cell lymphomas. There's no doubt about that. But we're starting to move on. The other reason why it's probably becoming less relevant is the company that makes MabThera will no longer be the only company that makes it. So it's coming off patent fairly soon. So most patents for treatments have a fairly short duration. It's generally 10 to 15 years. So in fact, there's a financial imperative for companies to come up with new treatments. Otherwise, they'll sort of lose their share of treatments, unfortunately. Now, MabThera works in a number of different ways. So it binds to CD20, that we do know, but it then recruits your immune system to do the job of killing the disease. It's another form of immunotherapy, but rather than using a vaccine strategy, it's using a treatment that somehow gets the immune system to know what it's meant to do. And it can work either through direct cytotoxic killing of the lymphoma or leukemia cells. Most of the time, the way MabThera works is through this antibody-dependent mechanism, but there's also a complement-dependent mechanism as well. So the various different monoclonal antibodies, as we call them, have slightly different ways in which they work, but they all at least work roughly through these pathways. So MabThera, the other name is rituximab. So there isn't a nomenclature for these monoclonal antibodies. So if it's got an ICSI in the middle like rituximab does, what that means is that the place where the MabThera binds is actually of mouse in origin, and the rest of it's human. So basically on these slides, blue is murine or mouse in origin, and orange or the reddy colour is of human origin. Now, these 2 new drugs, so ofatumumab is fully humanised, so fully human in origin, and the other drug I'm going to mention, obinutuzumab, is humanised. So obinutuzumab does have residual murine origin. So ofatumumab is the first to mention, so it's regarded now as a second generation of MabThera. It binds to a different site on the CD20 protein than MabThera does, which means that it's effective even when the expression of CD20 on the outside of the cell is relatively low. So this was some data that came out a long time ago. So this is in people with CLL, and it looked at people who were refractory to both fludarabine-based treatment and Campath, so 2 very potent treatments for CLL, or people who were refractory to fludarabine but had very bulky lymph nodes. Now, this doesn't look overly great data, so complete responses 0% and 1%, but there was a 58% and 47% overall response rate. So this drug was clearly effective in a disease that was refractory to more standard treatments. So while again, those figures don't look fantastic, it was actually very promising. So they very quickly moved it through to the randomised studies. And this is the Complement-1 study, which got published at the end of last year. And so this is, again, looking at people who are considered to be unfit for harder treatments like fludarabine. So use chlorambucil, one of the standard of care in older people with CLL who wouldn't tolerate more aggressive treatment. So you either got chlorambucil by itself or you got chlorambucil plus ofatumumab. And you can see here the green line are the people who got treated with ofatumumab. The blue line are those who just got chlorambucil by itself. So a very substantial improvement in progression-free survival. But similar to what we saw before, there's no difference in overall survival. Because CLL and some of these low-grade lymphomas are very long-lived diseases, relatively speaking, it means very long follow-up is sometimes necessary to pick a difference in overall survival. So the Complement-2 study hasn't been published yet, but it looked at more standard treatments, so fludarabine and cyclophosphamide, and then adding ofatumumab on top of that particular backbone. And what you can see here again, the ofatumumab substantially improved the progression-free survival over and above just getting the chemotherapy. Now, a very strong argument, and one of the things that the government will be annoyed about in terms of when it considers this new treatment, is that the comparison arm was fludarabine and cyclophosphamide. whereas in fact the standard of treatment for people who can tolerate it with CLL is fludarabine, cyclophosphamide and rituximab. So they may actually require some data comparing against a treatment that includes rituximab. So I suspect that in terms of this particular setting, so young fit people, ofatumumab may be a little way away yet before we're going to get access to it. But as of, I think about July this year, ofatumumab is now available for use in combination with chlorambucil in people who are unfit for standard treatment. And again, the restriction is very clear. So it needs to be CD20 positive CLL, it needs to be as part of first-line treatment, it must be in combination with chlorambucil, and the patient must be regarded as inappropriate for fludarabine-based treatment. They have left that little bit up in the air, so it's up to physician discretion. But most of the time that's pretty obvious. Now the reason why they've restricted it again at $21,000 for 6 doses of ofatumumab, Mabthera these days is about 10 to 12,000, so it's about double the cost of Mabthera. So that's the second generation of Mabthera. Now, quite remarkably, at the same time, we're now going to have access to the third generation. So this is the other one, obinutuzumab or Gazyva. So as I mentioned, it's the third generation. Again, it's about a 5 to 100-fold greater binding to CD20 than Mabthera, and that is about a 10-fold increase over and above ofatumumab, so potentially even more potent. One of the big concerns that got raised with this treatment when it was first studied was that it was perhaps too potent. So there was massive breakdown in tumour cells in some people, which led to a condition called tumour lysis syndrome, where you could go into acute renal failure from the poisons that got released. But with modification to the dosing, modification to some of the pre-medications, in fact it's all largely been sorted out now. So this is the main paper that got published at the end of last year. In fact, we were lucky enough to have Professor Goad come and visit the Royal Brisbane only 2 weeks ago to sort of discuss this data. So again, this was a paper that looked at the combination of obinutuzumab and chlorambucil, and more sensibly, the standard arm was rituximab and chlorambucil, so not chlorambucil by itself. So more reflects what we do in standard practice. And you can see here, so this is the progression-free survival curve in comparison to people who got chlorambucil alone, but more in comparison to people who got rituximab and chlorambucil. So a very significant lifting of the survival curves in patients who got Gazyva. And that was due to much higher response rates in the group who got Gazyva. What they also found, unlike the previous studies, there was an overall survival advantage. So Gazyva, when added to chlorambucil, actually had the effect of prolonging life. So the restriction for this one is far more detailed than the previous treatment. So it's potentially for the same group of patients who you could get ofatumumab to. So previously untreated CLL, you need to have reasonable renal function because the drug is excreted out through the kidneys. But they also define that you must have this thing called the Cumulative Illness Rating Scale, or CIRS. And you need to have a score of 6 or more on that, which basically tells us that you're unfit and therefore you're not fit enough to have fludarabine-based treatment. And you can also not have kidney function that's too good. So your kidney function needs to be somewhere between 30 and 70 mils per minute. And it has to be given in combination with chlorambucil, so you can't give it with other treatments. Now, this is going to be really complex in day-to-day practice, because what this CIRS score basically is we have to go through and rate every one of these organ systems, and you basically give a score to each one of those organ systems based on the degree of impairment. So basically none, mild, moderate, or severe disability, or in the case of a score of 4, potentially life-threatening. And so if you basically score 6, so if you had a 4 and a 2, you score 6 and you automatically qualify for that particular treatment. Or if you had 6 1s, for example. So there's a number of ways of getting there. But the government actually require us to submit documentation of that score when we submit it. So it's probably going to take about 45 minutes to an hour to do that. Now, again, the reason is it's double the cost of the ofatumumab. So it's 8 treatment cycles rather than 6, and it's about $42,000 ultimately for the treatment course. So that's part of the reason the government wants to make sure we're using it only in the group of people who they feel are likely to benefit. And it's the group of people who are included on the clinical study. So they're trying to match real life with what was seen in the clinical data. So the third of the treatments has now become PBS listed, is a drug called brentuximab. So this is basically an antibody-drug conjugate. So it's like Mabthera in that it's a monoclonal antibody. It doesn't bind to CD20, it binds to CD30. The difference is it has a small dose of a cytotoxic drug, so a chemotherapy attached to it, which is actually a very, very small dose. But what actually happens is that essentially the monoclonal antibody binds to CD30, it then gets taken up into the cell, and that very small dose of chemotherapy then actually gets released into the cytoplasm, and that small dose outside the cell becomes a massive dose inside the cell, so it basically is toxic to the cell. So it's essentially using the monoclonal antibody to target the chemotherapy to the place you want to deliver it to. So it's another way that we can use monoclonal antibodies to improve treatment. So there's been two scenarios where this treatment has been used. The first is in a relatively rare disease called anaplastic large cell lymphoma. And this is what we call a waterfall plot. So basically each of the individual lines is a patient who got the treatment. If you're above the line, that means your disease increased in size. If you're below this line, your disease decreased in size, so you had a response. And so basically the people down here had a complete response because they had a 100% reduction. But you can see that the overwhelming majority of people got more than 50% reduction in the size of their lymph nodes using this treatment by itself. All of these people had had previous chemotherapy, including transplants, autologous stem cell transplants, and many of them allogeneic stem cell transplants. So a group of very heavily pre-treated people where you wouldn't have expected this quite extraordinary response. Now, and this is what they basically, so this is the overall survival curve. So again, one of the problems is that it looks like if you follow people up for long enough, ultimately everybody will progress. But it's a very effective treatment. So what hopefully will become of this treatment is over time it will be incorporated into frontline treatments. So when you first walk through the door with this particular disease, it will be part of the strategy of treatment that you get. And this is an example of quite a dramatic response. So most of these black dots that you can see are areas of lymphomas in lymph glands lighting up on the PET scan. And you can see that essentially they've all disappeared. So this is the brain, these are the kidneys which gather up the glucose-labelled dye, and that's the bladder which then picks it up. So all the other stuff is resolved. So that's just with this treatment by itself. It's also been utilised in Hodgkin's lymphoma. Many more patients on the study because it's a much more common disease, but similar degree of effect. So quite extraordinary response in a group of very heavily pre-treated patients. And again, fairly decent survival curves given the nature of the disease that all of these people had. But like we saw in the anaplastic large cell lymphoma study, unfortunately if you follow people up, ultimately they will progress. So one of the ways they're looking at it now is if you have Hodgkin's lymphoma that has relapsed, you then have a stem cell transplant, is actually incorporating the brentuximab as a maintenance treatment after the transplant, in a similar way that many people in this room may have had Mabthera as a maintenance treatment after their lymphoma treatment. And again, there's a very significant rising of the curves as a consequence. So this is one of the concepts that the government's considering at the moment, is whether maybe this could be the way that we'll use this treatment going forward. Now, the TGA quite some time ago licensed the treatment for use in Hodgkin's lymphoma and in anaplastic large cell lymphoma. It is now available on the PBS as of earlier this year for anaplastic large cell lymphoma. Again, not as part of first-line treatment, but as part of second-line treatment. So you've had some form of treatment before and your disease has come back, you then become eligible for the use of brentuximab. So that's really good. Again, a very detailed series of forms and information that we have to send to the government. The reason is that if you're a fairly large person, the ultimate cost of 16 cycles of brentuximab could be in the range of about $330,000. Probably the lowest cost, if you're a fairly light person, would be about $150,000, $160,000. So it's because of a technology involved in the addition of the cytotoxic onto the monoclonal. So at the moment, we can't use it in Hodgkin's because Hodgkin's is a much more common disease. So if we're going to be looking at the sheer number of people who could be eligible for this treatment, the government needs to come up with a way for which we can use it. We're not optimistic at the moment that we're going to get access to all 16 doses. We think where it may become useful is in people who need a treatment to get them to a transplant, that the government may ultimately, say, fund 4 or 6 doses or something like that as a bridge to get to that transplant. It's very well tolerated. It's incredibly well tolerated, in fact, so very effective and very safe treatment. So we'll hear more about that. All right, now they're all the treatments that we've now got access to on the PBS. There's a couple of others just to mention that now have TGA indications, but are still going through the PBS negotiation process. So ibrutinib is a form of molecular inhibitor. It targets this thing called Bruton's tyrosine kinase. BTK is thought to have a very integral role to play in development of B-cell lymphomas in particular. Essentially, BTK is here. It has a number of downstream mechanisms that it enables to happen, including increasing proliferation of cells, so lymphoma cells grow more rapidly than normal healthy cells, but also turns off some of the natural death pathways. Most cells are meant to have a use-by date, and so apoptosis pathways get turned on once they hit the use-by date. So BTK is also thought to play a role in turning off some of those pathways. So this is an example of the response in patients with CLL who are put onto ibrutinib. So basically you get this unusual thing where you start on the drug, the lymphocyte count in the blood goes up dramatically and then comes down. And then you have this significant reduction in the size of lymph glands. And this was borne out in the study that was published going back a couple of years ago. What was most important about this treatment is that there are a group of patients with CLL who have a deletion of part of the long arm of chromosome 17. And this study actually looked at, in particular, whether this drug may be of benefit in those people. That deletion of chromosome 17 is associated with very, very poor response to traditional treatments. So only about a 10 to 15% response to fludarabine-based treatment. They actually found in this cohort of patients that they were able to get 50% responses. And again, this is using this drug by itself. It's a tablet. It's not an intravenous treatment. It's a tablet that you take every day like a blood pressure medication or a cholesterol medication. So it also sort of changes the paradigm of treatment. We're not talking about cycles of treatment where you come up and get an IV once every 3 weeks. It's about continuous treatment that you continue on for as long as the treatment works. So highly effective also in combination with bendamustine and rituximab. So the RESONATE-1 study was published last year. So we talked about ofatumumab before and how good it looked. This is an example of a paper that compared ibrutinib to ofatumumab in patients with relapsed refractory CLL. So even though ofatumumab looked very promising, ibrutinib looks even better. Based on the RESONATE study, the company that makes this have now put forward to the PBAC to get them to actually pay for this particular drug. There's also some evidence in diffuse large cell lymphomas. I haven't really spoken about the aggressive lymphomas today, but again, this ABC phenotype or non-GCB phenotype is a subset of diffuse large cell lymphoma that has a very poor response to traditional chemotherapies. And what they found is in people who had relapsed after previous treatment and relapsed within 12 months of rituximab-based treatment. So you probably expect about somewhere between a 5% chance of long-term survival. With ibrutinib, they were looking at about a 40% long-term survival. So that's something that's now gone forward into a phase 3 study. And in fact, we're going to have access to a study at the Royal Brisbane in the near future that's going to incorporate ibrutinib into, in addition to CHOP chemotherapy for older patients with diffuse large cell lymphoma. So basically, it's been a license to be used for a while. It was put to the July 1 meeting of the PBAC and it got knocked back. And it got knocked back basically because the government or the PBAC don't feel there's enough data. They need a bit more maturity of data. It also got knocked back because of expense. At the moment, potentially $100,000 to $150,000 per year, and that treatment's ongoing. If it's working, to stay on it. So again, it's going to require a bit of negotiation to get that price down. Pleasingly though, the company that makes it have a fully funded access scheme available. So for people with relapsed CLL or relapsed mantle cell lymphoma, the company will provide this drug free of charge. So certainly if there's anybody in this room who's in that scenario, talk to your doctors about it. So it is out there and very accessible. Idelalisib is very similar, so it's another molecular inhibitor. It works through the PI3K pathway. Has a fairly close association with the BTK pathway as well, have fairly similar downstream effects. What's important again, in comparison with chlorambucil, there was an 81% response rate in upfront people versus 13% with chlorambucil. Again, highly effective in people who had that chromosome 17 abnormality. And in fact, if you use idelalisib as frontline treatment for that, you have the same outcome as people who don't have the chromosome 17p abnormality. We've never seen that kind of data before. When used in combination with rituximab, 96% overall response rates in people with frontline treatment with CLL. And in fact, even when used by itself, 81% response rates. You don't even need to use rituximab. So a highly effective treatment in CLL. The other place where this drug's been studied is if you have follicular lymphoma that's refractory to rituximab. So there's some pretty compelling data for that as well. Now, once again, it's available on the TGA, but it hasn't even gone to the PBS as yet. It's about the same cost as ibrutinib. So we actually believe this is one of those circumstances where PBAC is going to hold a stakeholder meeting to get the two companies together, get various lymphoma experts together, and work out going forward how we can incorporate these treatments in a cost-effective way into the standard thing. Again, different company, but they also are currently providing fully funded access to idelalisib for CLL, like with ibrutinib. So essentially, as a haematologist, we now have a choice of either idelalisib or ibrutinib for refractory CLL, but they're also allowing access for refractory follicular lymphoma. So ibrutinib was mantle cell lymphoma. For this one, it's follicular. So the very final thing is to go back to the point we made about checkpoint inhibitors. These aren't even remotely close to being available in routine clinics at the moment. Nivolumab, there is a compassionate use program for patients with relapsed Hodgkin's. The only fly in the ointment is if you've had a donor transplant, the company will not provide access to it. And that's challenging for us. I work in a large bone marrow transplant unit, and most people with Hodgkin's lymphoma who are relapsed and refractory to the point where they're eligible for a donor transplant, we could not withhold that treatment to give them this at this point in time. So unfortunately, the company makes the point there's no clinical studies looking at safety in patients who've had a donor transplant, so they feel that they can't provide access to it. So checkpoint inhibitors, so remember the talk before about T cells responding to antigen presentation. PD-1 is a mechanism by which tumour cells can turn off the normal immune response to proteins. So basically, these checkpoint inhibitors are monoclonal antibodies that bind to either PD-1 or the PD-1 ligand on the tumour cell and essentially prevent PD-1 from inhibiting the immune response. So the immune response is restored. Now, the important group of people to look at here is the blue group. So this is a group of Hodgkin's patients who previously had brentuximab, you know, the newest kid on the block, looks amazing, and were refractory to that or had relapsed, and had had transplant as well. So nivolumab given to that group of people had pretty much 80–85% response, and most of those people getting a greater than 50% reduction, and some people actually getting a complete response. So nivolumab will be the next sort of important step, or pembrolizumab, which is another one we've got. So responses of 80 to 100% in this particular early cohort. Where this drug will be used, first of all, is in patients with melanoma. So metastatic melanoma, it looks quite extraordinary, and that's good to know because that's a disease that has an absolutely dismal outcome with currently available treatment. So hopefully it does change the treatment paradigm there. So as I said, a lot of information. So just hopefully everybody walks away from here knowing that in the last 12 months there's been quite an extraordinary sequence of new treatments that have become available in routine practice. And ultimately, if we do get a bit grumpy for the delays that we perceive in getting treatments, there is actually a reason why it does take a while. As I said, in the Australian system has been proven to be right on a few occasions where it's delayed treatments because of concerns about safety, and then ultimately the treatments have been found to be unsafe. The struggle will be cost. As you can see from all of those treatments, cost is enormous. And looking at some estimates, if we continue the way that we are, by 2025, the entire money currently spent on the federal budget will need to be dedicated to health unless we make some substantial changes to the way that we fund medications. All right, that's it for me. The role for prolonged MABThera treatment is different in different diseases. Again, the data for MABThera maintenance in mantle cell lymphoma, for example, isn't as strong as it is in follicular lymphoma. Follicular lymphoma is most of where the studies have been done. Mantle cell lymphoma doesn't look too bad, but there's some of the diseases, like for example diffuse large cell lymphoma, where there's very little evidence of a benefit for MABThera maintenance. It's very important as part of the treatment, but that more prolonged sort of exposure is less important. It also comes down to getting access to it. Technically speaking, under the previous arrangements with the listing for MABThera, you had to kind of not tell the whole truth to get access to it for mantle cell lymphoma. That's been fixed now, but for a long time there again. And now what that also meant was that generally you could only get access to around about 4 doses per time, rather than sort of more prolonged things. So there's a feeling that the treatments that you get, like with CHOP, have anti-inflammatory, immune suppressive effects, particularly with steroids. And there seems to be this rebound effect, that almost a rebound inflammatory effect that can happen after the treatment finishes. It's thought mainly to be due to the steroids, but probably also drugs like cyclophosphamide can do it as well. So because of the way that they work as an anti-inflammatory immune suppression type treatment, you get this very unusual rebound effect that occurs afterwards, where your immune system starts producing inflammation that wasn't there before you started the treatment. So, as I say, it's not common, but I have a number of people who described exactly the same thing, where it almost feels like they've got rheumatoid arthritis or something like that afterwards. Yeah. For most people it goes away, but in fact there are a small proportion of people who probably need to go back on a small dose of prednisone to help with it if it's really affecting your function.